Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webcast. My name is Christine Dorsey Davis. I'm the Executive Director of the Ohio chapter of the American Planning Association, and I'm your webcast moderator. Today is Friday, August 7th, and we will hear the presentation, Planning for Uncertainty, Risk-Based Transportation Planning. For technical help during today's webcast, you can type your questions in the chat box found in your GoToWebinar tool panel. And for your content questions related to the presentation, again, just type those in the chat box found in your GoToWebinar tool panel, and we will answer those at the end of the presentation during the Q&A. If your question is for a particular panelist, please try to state so just to make sure that the question gets directed to the right person. Coming up next on your screen is a list of our sponsoring chapters and divisions for 2020. So thanks to all of those participating APA chapters and divisions for making these webcasts possible and free to members. Today, in particular, we are sponsored by the Transportation Planning Division of APA, so thanks to them for joining us and for putting together this great panel. Coming up next on your screen is actually a screenshot of our webcast webpage, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. This is where we list all of our upcoming sessions for you to register. We are booked through the end of the year for all of our Fridays, and we are now taking on some Wednesdays and Thursdays, so make sure that you pay attention when you're registering. They're not all Fridays. We do have some Wednesdays and Thursdays mixed in. Like I said, this is a screenshot of our webcast webpage, so I just want to draw your attention to the tabs at the top. The prior webcast tab, that's where we post PDF copies of the slide decks. Distance education tab, we do have several sessions available for on-demand viewing through the end of the year, including ethics and law. Be sure to check that out. And there's my next screen. This session has been approved for 1.5 CM credits for live viewing. And you can log those credits by heading over to planning.org, logging into your My APA account, and then searching either by today's title or event number. If you don't get a chance to write those down, just head over to our webcast webpage. All that information is there for you so you can get those credits loaded. Make sure you like us on Facebook. Just search Planning Webcast and we'll pop up. That's where we post any immediate changes to the schedule and also when we add new sessions to our schedule. And lastly, make sure that you head over to YouTube, search Planning Webcast, and subscribe to our channel. Push the red button. We have over 3,000 subscribers and over 300 videos. We do record all of our sessions, including this one, and we post them to our YouTube channel. So I think that is it for my intro. I am now going to turn it over to Jennifer Carver, who's going to do a little introduction and get us started. Jennifer, it's all you.
Okay, great. While Jeremy pulls up the slides, I just want to thank everyone for coming today. And we had this great research project that we did with Florida Department of Transportation and these 3 universities in Florida related to risk-based transportation planning for uncertainty. And we developed it as part of our transportation plan update. So we want to tell you about our research and our lessons learned and some tools that we think might be helpful to you in your transportation planning. Next. So our presenters today, as I said, I'm with the Florida Department of Transportation. We also have Dennis Smith and Jeremy Crute from Florida State University here in Tallahassee. We have Tia Boyd from the University of South Florida in Tampa. And then we have Ruth Steiner from the University of Florida. So we have a great panel. Each of these researchers will tell you about their projects. Next slide. So this project, as we were starting to get moving on our Florida transportation plan, we wanted to look at the last plan that we had, and we had some scenarios in that plan, and we wanted to look at, we knew uncertainty and risk was going to be a big issue in our update of this transportation plan. So we created this research project that looked at how should the Florida transportation system evolve to support mobility in the future. How might the Florida transportation plan goal areas and visions change in response to risk and uncertainty? And then we also looked at our transportation planning processes in general, and how might these risks affect not just the plans and the projects that come out of it, but how should we incorporate risk into our actual planning process, including our business, from all of our planning and design through project implementation. So while this was started as a project that kind of helped us get started on our Florida transportation plan, our statewide plan for all of transportation in Florida, we really also were looking for some tools that we could use in all of our business and incorporating risk. Next slide. So what we did was we have these 3 universities that worked on the same scope of services and set of tasks. So, and because this was a research project, we were required to keep the projects separate up to a point while they were doing the research on the different tasks. And the tasks included a literature review and hazard assessment, consequence identification and management, planning implications for alternate futures or planning scenarios, and then identifying recommendations for how those risks could be addressed in project level transportation planning and project implementation processes. So there was no interaction between the universities during this primary research effort so that we could get a wide range of different insight into this issue. Later on in the process, we were able to collaborate, and I'll talk about that at the end of the session when to describe kind of how we're using the results of this research. Next slide. So what we started with was 5 areas of inquiry in uncertainty. You can see here population, economics, environment, technology, and global issues. So we were not just looking at climate issues or environmental risks. We were really wanting to see what were the trends and risks and uncertainties in all these areas, and how were they going to affect our planning process and our work at the Florida Department of Transportation. So next, you can see in your chat and here on the screen, we have a little survey for you and from Polleverywhere. So there's 2 ways to access the poll. If you can go to this website here, www.pollev.com/Jeremy Crute 213, so Jeremy Crute 213. If you can go to that on the web page, or you can do it by text, and you text Jeremy Crute 213 to the number 22333. So that's the address, is 22333. So if you would go into the poll, and then we'll put up the polling question for you. So our question is, what are the greatest hazards that the transportation system in your community will face over the next 25 years? And try to use 1-word answers. If your answer is more than 1 word, run them together or put a dash in between so they're connected, because this is a pretty cool word cloud, and we want to see the connections together. So I'm seeing flooding and funding as big issues. Hurricane, growth, funding, deterioration, state politics, equity, growth, terrorism, fire, roads, disaster, inundation, sprawl. So we're getting some specific hazards, we're getting some policies or land use implications. I see funding as the funding, and flood and equity are the big items, but there's quite a wide range of hazards that you've identified here. We can keep the poll open for a little bit, and you can respond but I think we'll move on. And so Dennis is going to talk about some of the work that Florida State University did on this project.
Great. Thank you, Jennifer. I'm Dennis Smith. I'm with Florida State University Department of Urban and Regional Planning. And Jeremy and I are going to talk to you a little bit about three components of the project: our approach to literature review, to a review of plans, and then finally, we want to have a little discussion about our approach to looking at assets at risk. And actually, Jeremy is going to start out with the first two slides here, but I wanted to provide you with this background and let you know that, again, each of the three universities were provided with the same scope of work, but we were not working collaboratively. We were working really in our own silos. And I think you'll find, and we'll reiterate it through the course of this presentation, it's pretty remarkable how closely our paths align. But I think Jeremy's prepared these first two slides, so let me turn it over to him. Go ahead, Jeremy.
Sure. Yeah, thank you, Dennis. And like you said, I'm Jeremy Crute. I'm the senior planner at FSU's Department of Urban and Regional Planning, and had the pleasure of working on FSU's team as part of this DOT project. And we, like with that poll question, we really wanted to first hear from you to get us sort of thinking about and wrestling with these issues and what are the biggest risks that we're going to have to be facing over the next 25, 30, 40 years. And it was really interesting to see that a lot of the funding and flooding issues were some of the top responses that we got when we asked that similar poll at the APA National Conference too. And so it's there definitely seems to be a sort of consensus that we all recognize that these are going to be major issues, and all recognize that we're going to have to figure out ways to address these risks and uncertainties within all of our planning processes moving forward. And you can see on this slide that the responses that you all had also mirrored the list of risks that we came up with through our literature review process. And again, like the issues of flooding and funding kind of rise to the top of in some of those categories. But again, we kind of all generally agree that these risks are coming. They're going to have a major impact on our transportation system, and that impact's only going to get bigger and bigger as time goes on. But again, the question of how we plan for them has been a little bit more difficult for us to answer. And I think in some ways the past few months has been a prime example of that, because the pandemic has made it very, very clear that the future can look very, very different than we anticipated. And if the world can change so drastically in a couple of months, it's a real challenge to figure out how to plan effectively 25 years into the future. And so before some of my colleagues get into some of the recommendations and the tools for how we can begin thinking about that and doing that, we wanted to quickly highlight, there we go, quickly highlight how the first step in our process was to review what transportation agencies, and particularly DOTs, were already doing to address this challenge of future risk and uncertainty. And there's a lot of really wonderful work that's happening across the country, but one interesting thing that we found was that very few have really begun to integrate risk or an assessment of risk throughout their entire planning process. Risks and uncertainties might be addressed at very specific points, like within a long-range transportation plan or during a feasibility study. But we're still wrestling with how to make the entire process nimble and agile enough to adapt to all of these evolving risks and evolving conditions. And since so many of our infrastructure projects can take 3, 5, or 10 plus years to go from idea to implementation, we often don't have many touch points built into our processes where we can take that step back to reevaluate how these rapidly evolving risks and conditions might necessitate adjustments to our plans. And our project for DOT was sort of the first step of trying to figure out how to help the state of Florida to do that. And we hope that the rest of the presentation will give you a few ideas and tools for how to do that as well. And so with that, I'm going to hand it back off to Dennis, who's going to tell you a little bit about one of the ways that FSU tried to address these issues.
And remember, I think you might be on mute.
Thanks, Jeremy, for the setup, and thanks for reminding me I was on mute there. One of the joys of navigating our virtual environment here. But I'd like to jump in and talk to you about as kind of a second phase of the project. The Department of Transportation was interested in understanding how various assets around the state were vulnerable to the range of conditions that were discussed earlier and were identified in the literature review. And I think we all recognize that risk-based asset management is essential to ensure that we have a resilient transportation system. It helps for the long-term sustainability of our system, and it also does very practical things like lower life cycle costs by allowing us to focus mitigation dollars in areas that we anticipate will be susceptible to higher levels of risk. And so this was kind of a complex task for our students to undertake, just kind of figuring out how to get their arms around this. It's also a little bit different than the rest of the project in that it was very present oriented rather than future oriented. The idea was to understand our assets today and how they are susceptible to those range of risk factors that were presented today as well as into the future. So let me tell you a little bit about the students' approach to this piece of the project. I mean, really, the first part of it was to try to figure out what assets should we look at. And so in understanding the assets, we relied on a range of available state databases. And so we were able to tap into our state Department of Transportation asset management plan. And based on my review of long-range transportation plans and planning documents from other states, I would say that if you wanted to repeat this process, you probably have a good asset management plan within your state that has a fairly good database of the various assets, at least those that are related to transportation. But of course, we understood that there were quite a number of assets that were not transportation related, assets that were more environmentally focused, as well as assets that were really of an economic nature. And so we reached out and investigated other databases that were maintained by state agencies, our Department of Environmental Protection being one of the more notable ones. And our students created a database that was just, really massive. So they had this kind of GIS-based tool that geolocated as you can imagine, hundreds and hundreds of actual assets within each of the facility types that you can see listed on your screen as an example. And that list of asset types, the categories, were compared with information that was found in other state long-range transportation plans. So we were able to expand the list to make it as comprehensive as possible. And so, step one, develop this list of assets. Once that's understood, what do you do with it? What our approach was to take a look at the state based on regions, administrative regions, as well as regions that we derived based on understandings of variation in risk. And so let me talk about the easy part first. That is the administrative regions. Our state has 7 DOT districts. And so the database was sortable by each of the 7 DOT districts. But as you can imagine, with your state, wherever you're calling in from, as with Florida, some areas are more susceptible to risk, whether it's natural hazard risk or economic or demographic change that creates uncertainty than others. And so we decided to look at the state geographically in terms of communities or in our case, counties that were coastal versus counties that were inland. And we also were interested in counties that were urban versus counties that were rural. Our literature review, as well as our coordination with expert practitioners in the state, really let us understand that the level of risk inherent in those different types of areas varied. And so that's how we set up our kind of our geographic subdivision of looking at our assets at risk. So the next step really comes into play, and that is, well, how do we rank and score that? How do we assign some numbers to this framework that were established? And so the way in which that was done was through a series of surveys and insights that the students gleaned from the literature review. So for each of the, as I said, many hundreds of individual assets, the students were able to determine, based on whether they were urban or rural, inland or coastal, some level, high, medium, or low, to which they might be vulnerable to a whole range of different perils, for lack of a better word, within each of the 5 risk categories. So within population, within economics, within the concept of global issues, as well as the environment. And then these scores were aggregated for individual facilities within the asset categories to provide some kind of an array of understanding of relative levels of risk. So, that was kind of step 1 in this process of creating some numerical values here. The second step, as I had mentioned initially, was getting insight from the community of practice. And so after the students had some understanding of the aggregate or cumulative level of risk, they reached out via survey instrument to planners throughout the state. I had the advantage of having 2 classes work on this: a summer class, my summer studio in 2018, and then the fall class, the subsequent fall class. So my summer students set up this entire framework and built the database and disseminated a survey that asked for some kind of professional evaluation of their methodology, and then also insights on ranking. And really the underpinning for that, and how I assigned validity to that process, was through research like the work done by Philip Tetlock with super forecasting. And it's really that basic concept. If you ask enough professionals about their opinion on how things will be looking in the future, you're generally going to get some relatively good insights into what the future will look like. And if any of you like Michio Kaku, who is the physicist, the astrophysicist, who's pretty popular on some of the Science Channel networks, in his books, he does basically that. You know, he interviews a ton of experts and kind of cobbles together various visions of the future, and it tends to be able to prognosticate with some degree of accuracy. So that was really the kind of the theoretical underpinning of what we were doing here. And so I mentioned the two classes because after our summer 2018 studio class came up with the methodology, and they developed a scoring of both individual and then, you know, this collective cumulative assessment of assets at risk. The fall studio tested that by conducting the same survey at our state APA conference, and that was a great way to validate the findings, which they actually were able to do. So what did we find out? Well, we found out that our transit facilities across the state were most susceptible to risk relative to other assets. Airports and seaports as well. And they really fell into a level that was significantly higher than other assets. Again, this doesn't really surprise me because of the nature of some of those facilities, the level of complexity in transit systems, particularly rail systems, and again, the level of complexity in, you know, building and maintaining an airport or a seaport. And so they fell kind of higher up on the list. Things that were much lower down on the list, further down on the list, were obviously things like trails and bike lanes and the like. Why is this helpful? It was part of our scope in order to help the state DOT better meet the goals of its long-range transportation plan to promote what they call an agile, resilient, and quality infrastructure. But my feeling is it helps to shine a light on specific asset types, so that when we are thinking about long-range asset management and the allocation of resources for building new facilities of this type or for mitigation, we can use that in the decision-making process. I want to add something here that's a little bit off script, but just to say that the work that the students did in this project really laid the foundation for some follow-up work that I've been able to do with some colleagues with our State Department of Transportation, looking at the use of various factors for understanding the vulnerability of our transportation system to a range of perils over the long term. So for long-range forecasting. So I was really grateful for some of the research that the students were able to conduct and kind of testing it out in this lab environment. So I think that's really all I have to present on this piece of the puzzle, which was understanding state assets at risk. There's quite a lot more to this that I'd be happy to share with any of you after the presentation through follow-up.
All right, thanks, Dennis. Let's move over to Tia to talk about some tools.
And Tia, you might be on mute because we're not hearing you. Tia, we're still not hearing you. Jennifer, would you like to move on? Oh, Tia, are you there?
Yes. All right. I was
Oh,
having some
yay.
issues connecting, but
Okay,
I'm
good. We got you.
great. So yes, I am Tia Boyd, a research associate with the Center for Urban Transportation Research at the University of South Florida. And I'll talk to you a bit today about some of the tools we identified to evaluate risk and uncertainty, with a focus on one tool in particular. But to start, we did look at several tools within the adaptive planning processes, and really looked at tools specific to that area. We looked at tools such as decision trees, asset vulnerability tables, as Dennis described, cascading effects analysis tools, and various other spreadsheet-based tools such as a risk register. And we really found that the risk register, they're extremely versatile for identifying, categorizing, analyzing, and monitoring risk, and can be used to identify consequence mitigation strategies. So in the next slide, we'll take a look at what the risk register that we developed for this project looks like. So the risk register describes the characteristics of risks, such as the likelihood of occurrence, the impact or consequences, the root causes, affected objectives, and overall risk rating. It is used to evaluate the risk event's ability to hinder or enhance the agency's policy goals. They can be used throughout the planning process and during stakeholder engagement. When used during stakeholder engagement, for example, they can help stimulate meaningful discussions between participants and the facilitating agency. Overall, they are customizable to meet agency needs and can be developed as either a simple checklist or a more comprehensive risk register, as we'll look at in the next few slides, using the 2015 Florida Transportation Plan Goal number 4, more transportation choices for people and freight. So we'll take a closer look at what some of these components of the risk register are. The risk event is the potential threat or opportunity for each of the agency goals. We use several techniques from the literature to identify potential risk events, including brainstorming, categorizing to identify risks based on categories that prompted the recognition of risks or opportunities, or threats or opportunities, sorry. And in this case, during this project, we categorized the risk using the 7 Florida statewide planning goals. We also used cause and effect analysis, where we stated each risk in terms of root cause and effect to help us analyze the effects of the risk and identify those root causes more clearly. Next slide, please. The overall risk is the product of likelihood, consequence, and vulnerability, and correlates to the risk level. As you can see, I have both highlighted on the slides, and it's just a, we have the numeric value, and then how that numeric value translates based on those numbers. A scale of 1 to 5 was developed for likelihood, consequence, and vulnerability. Using those scales, we adapted the risk formula identified in the literature to calculate the overall risk. So once again, it's likelihood times consequence times vulnerability. A 5-point scale was developed to organize overall risk, where 1 to 24 is low risk and 100 to 125 is critical risk. And in between overall risk and risk level, you see a column for time frame. We developed several categories for time frame, including current, which is that little C up top, 2010 to 2020. Emerging is 2020 to 2030. Near future is 2030 to 2040. Far future is 2040 to 2070. And uncertain we included because for some of these risks, we were aware that the time frame is generally unknown. We know that there will be a risk or could possibly be this risk, but it's not clear yet when that risk will occur or risk event will occur. In the next slide, we'll look at consequence management strategies, which are proposed approaches to manage specific types of risk events. We identify different actions for threats and opportunities. As you can see in the top right corner, for threats, we can avoid, which is to take proactive action to ensure the probability or impact of a risk is eliminated. We can mitigate, which is to prepare contingency plans to address the consequences of risk that cannot be eliminated or controlled. We can transfer, which is to shift responsibility to another party with authority to address the risk, or we can coordinate, which is to collaborate with other agencies to address the potential risk. For opportunity, we can exploit, share, or enhance. And all of these are actions that can be taken by the agency to really take advantage of an opportunity, whether it be taking immediate action, sharing the action with another agency, or doing something to strengthen or reinforce the conditions that result in an opportunity. So as mentioned, we use the 7 Florida Transportation Plan goals from the 2015 plan, and the results were applied to a robustness screening process using the goals and the alternative futures or scenarios that were in the Florida Transportation Plan. The results were further tested by our adaptive transportation planning course. And through this testing with the risk register, we found that based on the information that we had at hand at the time, that technology and funding have the most impact in determining if risks will present threats or opportunities in Florida. So that was our overall findings. And again, because we are likely to see many changes and nothing is static as we proceed into the future, those identified risks may change. But at the time, based on what we have, that is what the tool told us was most likely to cause either threats or opportunities for our state. So in the next slide, we have another Polleverywhere. So I want you to think about your state or your jurisdiction, and we can do within the next 25 years because that's what we did in the initial poll. But with those options, select the most disruptive or extreme event that may affect the future of transportation. So we have population or demographic trends, economic shifts, environmental impacts or natural hazards, advancements in technology, and global issues. So this is something similar to what we did for the brainstorming session to identify those risk events. So just thinking what you know, the information you have on hand or your experience with planning for transportation, just what comes to mind or what have you seen have the most potential to cause a risk or cause the most disruption in the next 25 years. So right now, economic shift seems to be first on the list, and then we have environmental impacts or natural hazards a little ways behind, but economic shifts really seems to be the number one issue of concern. Looks like technology is in line with environmental and natural good. So yeah, economic shifts, number one, and then for number two, we have environmental impacts and natural hazards and advancements in technology. So good. With that, I will pass it on to Ruth.
Thank you, Tia. I'm Ruth Steiner. I'm a professor at the University of Florida, and this is some work done by my students in the context of a studio. So like the other universities, we did work in preparation for the student work on this project. And we quickly saw that, yes, finance and economic impacts were important, but for a state like Florida, environmental impacts on the transportation system were really a critical part of the discussion, and especially the sea level rise issue, because we are a relatively low-lying state and we have a lot of coastline. What we ended up doing in the analysis, and the other concept that nobody's really mentioned, is that we also were asked to look at synergistic effects. And I would say that this study really is a pretty good example of looking at synergistic effects. Next slide, Jeremy. So what we ended up doing was we started with existing information, and we were planning in the 40 to the up to 50-year time frame was more, and the sea level rise data, we looked at 2080 because that's done in 20-year periods, time frames, and we looked at the the typical data used in this analysis. We really used existing data. Basically, this is the Army Corps of Engineers and the NOAA, National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, and basically looked at 3 different scenarios. Although you see 5 on here, they do have 5 different scenarios ranging from the low to medium to high. What I am told by people who spend time looking at this is that in general, the impacts have been greater than they anticipated at any given time period. So that was part of the justification for looking at low, medium, and high. It's also, from my perspective, a way to think about, address what was fundamental to this project, which is understanding uncertainty associated with estimates. Next slide, please. So in looking at that, what we ended up looking at was there were 5 students, and each one looked at the literature on these topics, understanding the nature of the risks. And then we, in each case, looked at the impacts. So we looked at first, one student looked at vulnerable populations. As all of you know, Florida is also not only vulnerable to sea level rise, we are also vulnerable to major hurricanes. And during those kind of hurricane events, we have to deal with the question of, are we going to evacuate populations, or are we going to weather out the storm in place? The second question was really the question of how much the future population increase would affect the coastal areas in particular. The analysis you'll see in a moment is looking really only at the coastal counties in the state. The third question was, what is the impact going to be on personal property, the residents, and the inundation and road, and the ability, essentially the ability of people to live in those areas, and the ability to get around in communities. The fourth one was really beginning to look at critical infrastructure, which was looking generally at freight, airports, seaports, and first responder facilities, police and fire stations, and schools. And then finally, there was one student who's particularly interested in intermodal rail, and really, I would say, as a form of it is while it's a form of critical infrastructure, his analysis really was looking at, from the freight system perspective, how are we going to continue to have intermodal freight connectivity throughout the state. Next slide, please. And what I'll do here is sort of show the results of that analysis. This is showing future populations, and you can see from this diagram the importance of future populations, which is if things go as projected, we're talking about another more than almost 2 million in population additional population that will live in coastal areas that are vulnerable both to sea level rise and to the storms associated with sea level. The other thing I did want to mention, and this is sort of a challenge with this data, is that we ended up using existing data, but as an example, there sort of are separate risks, first associated with what you'd call rainy day and increased frequency of flooding. And that risk is separate from storm surge. But when we're looking at this analysis, we also recognize that the storm surge data is really based on existing projections, largely because it would require a lot of pretty challenging modeling for if you have additional sea level rise and you have storm surge on top of that, what happens. So this is really using some, in some respects, while it builds in a high risk scenario, there is an additional high risk beyond what we see in the high risk scenarios in all of these results I'm reporting. The next slide, please. We then looked at vulnerable populations, and as you can see, not surprisingly, although not consistently, to some extent you can identify the most populous counties in the state, the Miami-Dade and Broward, but you can also recognize here with vulnerable populations the increases in the locations that have more of an aging population. Places like Pinellas and Lee are not necessarily the next highest in terms of population, but they end up showing up here because we are highlighting where current populations are. Again, we don't know where current populations are going to move in the future, which in fact ends up again being another source of risk and uncertainty in this analysis. Next slide, please. Roads and property, the analysis looked at here was, first of all, how many miles of roadway are going to be affected under the three scenarios. And as again here you can see sort of the geometric progression of the level of risk, which is both roadways affected, but also on system FDOT. So in those cases, and evacuation routes, again, this is the sort of synergistic effects of not just the sea level rise, but also the storm surge. And then you begin to see the impact on property, the number of parcels affected and the area affected. So we're talking, millions of acres affected when you get to the high, even when you get to the moderate risk, the medium range impacts. And the taxable property value, again, is current property value, not future property value. So again, you can begin to look at these and begin to understand the magnitude of the impact on a state like Florida associated with using what could be argued somewhat conservative estimates, largely because they don't consider the synergistic effects in the long term. Next slide, please. So finally, we looked at specific critical infrastructure and how it fit into this scenario. And what you begin to see, for instance, is that even with the low estimates of impacts, we start to see impacts, not surprisingly, on our seaports, and in particular, in addition, on our airports. And we begin to see significant impacts by the time you get to the 2080, the high impacts. And again, these are somewhat largely centered on the Southeast Florida. And if you know Florida politics, that region has been most proactive in attempting to deal with the impacts of sea level rise of all the regions in the state. Next slide, please. And finally, when we look at intermodal freight, we also, for example, here see impacts not in Southeast, but in Volusia County, which is in sort of probably a central coastal East Coast Florida. By the time we only look at the low level impacts, the Florida East Coast main line is in fact is the coastal line as opposed to the CSX-A line, which is further inland. So you naturally would expect more impact on the coastal line. So you can go to next, and I'll turn it back to Jennifer.
Okay, great. Thanks, Ruth. So you've heard about some of the work that the universities did, and this by no means describes everything that they did as part of this project. What I want to cover to close the presentation is some of the collaboration that was done after the research portion of the project, and then how we're using this information that resulted from this study. And I should have said at the beginning, I think Dennis and the others pointed out that an integral part of these projects was to include planning students and other students at these universities. So we specifically designed this project to have planning students who are looking at all of these new trends, to have them gain some knowledge, but also provide their innovative ideas into our process. So once they were done with the research part of the project, we got them together in March of 2019 as we were getting ready to start the Florida Transportation Plan update. And we had them help us plan the long-range visioning session that we were doing as part of the plan, where we looked at our current plan, the 2015 plan you've heard mentioned, and really get a wide range of participants. And we had the students give a panel on upcoming trends and a discussion. And then we also used a version of the risk register during that long-range visioning session. The students were also able to support the session as helping with the small group facilitation, and then the posters that had been created as part of this project were available with the students and could discuss them with the participants. So that was a really great part of this project, and this project actually was recognized by the Florida APA as an outstanding student project. So we are also continuing with the community of practice that we've started gathering here with the experts that Dennis was talking about, and just looking at how do we incorporate risk into our planning processes. So we've had a number of ways that we're incorporating this. We also had a resilience subcommittee as part of the Florida Transportation Plan update, and the material coming out of this project was a great start to the discussions of what was important for including moving forward these risks and getting to a resilient transportation system. And then we're combing through all of the materials that came out of this project and identifying tools and resources that we should move forward with, including ideas about integrating adaptive processes and the consequence management processes, and incorporating benchmarks and thresholds into our planning processes, and also using the risk register, modifying that, and using it to assess risk level, especially during stakeholder engagement in the planning process. We're also looking at how to incorporate equity measures into our work, and then starting to look at one of the universities pointed out that a need to recognize the tipping points on things that have an economic impact on the state and local economies as a result of climate change, which kind of goes with what we saw from you all in the poll, that economic issues and funding are major issues here. And then there was also a recommendation in the research to start looking at statewide vulnerability assessment to evaluate risks, and with some ideas about how that might be done. So we are continuing with our resilience research, including a project to start to incorporate resilience and uncertainty, as we've discussed here, into project development and design. And so there's a lot of tools that are coming out of this project that we think will help us incorporate resilience into both our transportation system and our processes, so that we can address whatever uncertainties are coming forward. So with that, I'd like to turn to any questions that you might have. So please enter your questions in the question panel. And we did have one question already, which was, I think for Dennis. how does the risk to assets evaluation done by FSU differ from a program like HAZUS? And what is the benefit to developing this new process instead of using something existing and well vetted? So Dennis?
That's a great question. Can you hear me well, Jennifer?
Yes, we can hear you.
Great, thanks. For those folks who might not be familiar with the term HAZUS, back quite some time ago, I think it was 1997, FEMA came out with a loss estimation software called Hazards US. So it's the word HAZUS is a portmanteau for Hazards United States. And right now, the current version of HAZUS, I believe they're up to about 4.0, looks at a range of hazards: flooding, hurricanes, flood risk from tsunamis, coastal surge, earthquakes. There's a HAZUS earthquake module that might be relevant for your state. And it's a fantastic tool for looking at natural hazards and understanding the potential dollar impacts through some standardized loss estimation modeling. And so let me just explain why HAZUS isn't the solution to the problem we were facing and how what we were doing was a little bit different. I think I can do that best in talking about it kind of at three levels. The first is that we were asked to help the state understand the entire array of assets that are kind of under their control as they might be impacted or be vulnerable to changes or uncertainty in those 5 areas that were laid out early in the presentation. Changes in population, demographics, economics, environmental threats, which would include natural hazards, global issues, and so those issues, as you can see, there are a number of kind of parameters that just simply aren't picked up by HAZUS. Clearly, HAZUS would be a great tool for understanding the vulnerability of specific assets to the specific hazards that HAZUS can look at. And I've been a HAZUS user for many years, so we in fact did get the students to work with HAZUS a little bit. The second area where I do have some concern about HAZUS in an approach like this is, well, HAZUS has made some inroads recently. It is essentially a loss estimation model. And so some of the really fundamental factors relating to social vulnerability, well, as I say, it has improved. We do miss out on some of the understanding of how social vulnerability impacts the vulnerability to a facility. And so some of our work tried to do that. And then the third aspect was kind of ground truthing with the community of practice. So those, I hope that answers your question. HAZUS is a great tool. I certainly don't want to take away from it. It was not the tool to address this task that was assigned to us completely. It's a great application for understanding, one dimension of this task. And so we took a kind of a more comprehensive approach to understand asset risk at really a higher level, at a level that would be beneficial for long-range transportation planning. Clearly, if you were going to be doing your 5-year transportation plan or a Section 322 hazard mitigation plan or something of that nature, you might need a higher degree of detail in your analysis. So I hope that helps.
Okay, great. Thanks, Dennis. The next question I'll turn to Ruth, Dr. Steiner. How did you define vulnerable population in your project? You're muted.
No. I'm going to be honest, I don't know the answer directly to that, although in most of our work, we start with identifiable groups. That would be aging population, young people, people who can't drive is one definition I think of as in transportation planning as vulnerable, but there is also data available on persons with disabilities that might prevent them from driving. So that's sort of it is an ongoing discussion. I keep hearing about hidden disabilities, for example. I also hear the critique of just because you're old doesn't mean you can no longer drive. So, and especially the healthy older adult population. So I think, being very specific on that. The other way to think about it is what are the agencies, state agencies that are providing their services is another sort of data source that could be used to refine those kind of numbers.
All right, great. Dennis, do you want to mention how we're defining vulnerable populations in this upcoming research? You're muted.
Jennifer, that's a really good question. Our lab has done some work, as has Dr. Steiner at UF, looking at vulnerable populations, and there are a lot of ways to understand that group or to build that group. I would say a really good reference tool is one that was developed by the CDC, and what the CDC does is you can go right to their website. They provide 15 census-based parameters that they look like, and it does pick up age, income, ethnicity, gender, some of the real principal categories. And so in the work that we are currently doing for DOT, we use some combination of that. We may weight the factors somewhat differently given Florida and issues related to aging populations and populations where in the household it's English as a second language, or households without vehicles. So some of the work that we're doing for you now, we weight those factors a little more heavily. But again, that's an approach and some guidance I might provide to the listeners.
Okay, great. Thank you. Another question we got was, how will the modal agencies use the risk assessments to inform their asset management planning and activities? Who wants to take a stab at that?
I was thinking you should, Jennifer.
Well, I know that at the Department of Transportation, we are doing a vulnerability assessment for our strategic intermodal system, which is our designated system of high priority transportation facilities in the state. And that vulnerability assessment is looking at a wide range of hazards, including flooding and storm surge and sea level rise, but also extreme heat, wildfire risk, and other hazards as well, and developing a resilience action plan for how to address that, mainly on that strategic intermodal system, which includes things like the major roadway corridors, the interstates, key evacuation routes. It also includes airports, rail facilities, and major transportation hubs and connector roads or facilities to those hubs. So it's a pretty broad system with the priority of moving people and goods. So it's not meant to be your neighborhood streets. And so, but that vulnerability assessment can then be used to as a model for evaluating the rest of our state facilities, including the transit system, rail, the airports, and they're all kind of doing their own, starting to look at their own needs for addressing some of these issues.
Mhm.
Jeremy,
Jennifer, I could add a tiny bit to that too. We're working on a project now for the DOT, looking at developing an approach to evaluating the vulnerability of transportation assets to wind and water related perils. And we're doing that in conjunction with the Florida A&M University and FSU College of Engineering. That'll be developing a tool actually to help with that. But one of the questions that kind of came up in our dialogue, or I would say one of the admonitions to us, was to recognize the difference, at least in Florida, between our coastal counties and our inland counties, and the types of threats and perils that they are facing. And Jeremy, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
I think the main thing I was thinking about is just, in addition to thinking about the difference between coastal and inland areas, the types of factors and risks that apply also varies a lot based on urban versus rural. And so it's one thing that, at least as related to this project, the needs for each modal system vary significantly based on the context that it is, and then the risks that impact each of those areas also vary significantly on that. And so that was certainly one of the issues that we wrestled a lot with throughout this whole process, was trying to figure out how we can develop risk assessment tools, for the whole state of Florida that also are context specific enough that are actually useful for local communities and each jurisdiction that might be looking to use some of these tools. And so I think that was sort of why we kind of focused a lot on trying to provide ideas for at what points within the process folks should start doing these, so that if the actual tool that they're using it might vary from context to context, the process of taking of finding this touch point to reevaluate the risks that might impact that particular project is still relevant between different contexts.
Right, and I think that a couple of follow-ups there. One is that we finished the project that you're learning about today at the end of the fall of 2018, so at the beginning of 2019, and it was used by the state to help support their Florida Transportation Plan state transportation process. But what Jeremy and I are looking at are the planning processes that are ongoing at the regional level through the MPOs, the regional planning councils, some intergovernmental climate plans that are being undertaken, and how some of this guidance can influence the decision making of those processes. So we're really happy to see that happen, that this is really, some of the concepts here just keep reiterating themselves,
Great, thanks. So we'll move on to the next set. There's kind of two related questions. The first one was there any serious discussion about abandoning the barrier islands? As you may know, in Florida, we have a series of barrier islands along the East Coast, and then also along the Gulf Coast as well, that have quite a bit of development on them. And then a related question in considering hazard vulnerability is the option of relocating transportation assets being considered. So I'll start with the state approach, and then I'll turn it over to Ruth first, I think, and then we'll go from there. So at the state, as I mentioned, we are looking at this vulnerability assessment for our strategic intermodal system, and part of that process is to develop an action plan. That plan is not completed yet, so I don't know if it will include a lot of specific recommendations for moving transportation facilities. I do know that as part of some federal guidance, there's a requirement to look at projects that have been repaired, or at roads or transportation facilities that have been damaged and repaired 2 or more times. There's a requirement to look at alternative measures, including relocation. So, you know, these conversations have been around for years, and in a few cases, we have relocated some facilities along the coast that keep getting damaged. But we're really at Florida DOT just getting into the conversation of the long-term risk and starting to get some data and start to look at that. It is certainly part of the conversation when we decide whether or not to do a permanent repair for the facility back in the same place. But I want to turn it over to Ruth because I know her students looked at a lot of these issues.
We looked at those issues, but I would say I think there's a couple of aspects to that question, because obviously the DOT only has certain roadways under their control, and they need to deal with and negotiate with local governments on the road. So we recognize there's flooding both on DOT facilities, but there's also on, if there's no connectors to those roadways, that integrity and the connectivity of the network is compromised. I have a colleague who's been doing and looking at some things in the Tampa Bay area, and there's a large number of regional initiatives to try to understand the vulnerability and really get partners on the same page on, like the Southeast in particular has had ongoing consortium they've been around for over a decade, and there's starting to be other groups forming, I'm told, in Orlando area, the Tampa area, and Southwest Florida. But I would also suggest that there's a big issue associated with local land use regulations and state. Dennis may know more about the decision in St. Johns County where they were told they wanted to abandon a road leading to people's property, and they were basically told they couldn't do that. And so I think as much as we begin to understand vulnerability, we also need to begin to do adaptation planning. And to the extent that Florida's growth management framework has gone from being a top-down statewide to much more decentralized, I think that is going to be an acute, very important issue for local governments, especially coastal ones in Florida. So I'll pass it on. Dennis is shaking his head, so he looks like he must have something he wants to say.
The only thing I really want to add there is that, I mean, in a sense, your question is rhetorical because we understand that, particularly when you're looking at long-range transportation planning, in light of the 5 parameters, one of which is environmental, which would include natural hazards, retreats inevitable in some scenarios. And so I believe we've provided some context, some understanding of the absolute risk to specific pieces of infrastructure. Ruth's University, the University of Florida, under a contract with the state Department of Transportation, developed a wonderful tool, the Sea Level Rise Sketch Planning Tool, which I would recommend everyone go out and take a look at. But it really does underscore the absolute vulnerability of these facilities. And you know, we can make whatever recommendations we want, and we are going to be navigating through public policy that will require some build back or will prohibit isolation. But at some point, that's going to have to fall by the wayside because we have a vision of what the kind of the natural future will look like.
Great, thanks. So there's I think it's more of a comment that this is the discussion on whether development should be further promoted in areas that are known to be vulnerable, and that transportation assets provide opportunity for developments on the areas to exist. And that is certainly the case in Florida. We have, Ruth mentioned, we have long-term land use and community planning requirements for the state, for local governments to develop comprehensive plans. And really, there's also some requirements on what they call peril of flood planning in their coastal management element of their comprehensive plans. The state oversight of that process has been greatly diminished in the last 8 or 9 years, but local governments are really still looking at those issues as we have seen more and more issues coming up. And our Department of Environmental Protection has a coastal resilience program that provides a lot of funding for local communities to do vulnerability assessments, adaptation plans, resilience plans, and really look at these issues. So I would say that the communities within Florida are really looking at land use and relocation and different options. And at the state, we are recognizing or are continuing to recognize that our transportation facilities and transportation decisions, both by the state and by local communities, you know, those transportation and land use decisions need to be integrated so that they can support each other to have the safe and vibrant communities that we need to have. So that it's definitely something we're working on. But as you can imagine, there's a number of challenges. Let me see if there are, so another question that came up, and this is probably a good one, is what are the next steps for these projects? And I'll start by saying, as I mentioned, you know, we're looking through the results of these projects and finding all the pieces of it that we think we can move forward into the Florida Department of Transportation programs and processes, because there were a lot of great ideas that brought forward by the students and their professors that we can start to incorporate. And it's a learning process at the Florida Department of Transportation. I think the planning offices and some of our district staff are, you know, working with the communities who are really out ahead on addressing these issues. And so we're you know, working kind of systematically to incorporate things into Florida DOT's programs. We've recently approved a resiliency policy for resiliency of state transportation infrastructure that, you know, calls for us to incorporate resilience into all of our project design, planning, and maintenance, and all of that. So we're working through that. But I also wanted to turn it over to Ruth, to the university folks, to say, you know, from their perspective, where do we go next?
Go ahead, Dennis.
I just want to say that the concept of planning is challenging. I mean, short-term planning is challenging, and we understand the processes. But long-term planning is really a whole different game. I mean, when we're talking about planning for 20 years from now, that's a long way away. And when we're talking about planning or trying to understand what the future looks like in 50 years, that's a very long way away. But I think what we're finding is it's essential that we do that. There's not a lot of literature about how to do that, but one of the thoughts is that it's very important to at least build a practice around trying to understand what the world is going to look like, because things are so dynamic with so many factors changing. So I think I just wanted to start off with that. And Ruth, did you want to add to that? I know we've had conversations around that area too.
Well, one way to think about the difficulty of predicting long-range planning is to ask how many of you would have predicted we would be in the situation we're currently in. And I would point out that among the 3 schools, Dennis is the only one who talked about a pandemic. I would say I considered it a low risk but high impact kind of event and didn't spend a lot of energy on it because I was thinking more in that, the range of possibilities. But the challenge of, I would have to say one of the things this really highlighted to me was the difficulty of doing truly long range planning. But it was also, I have to say, for me, this opened my eyes to all sorts of areas of transportation, synergies with other areas that I'd really never thought about. The overlapping, it's not just that we've got sea level rise, but historically our population has always gone there. And then you start adding other layers onto it and you begin to say, this is overwhelming, especially, and the uncertainty of every single one of these things in the long term. It also, I think, gave me an appreciation of scenario-based planning and really how difficult it is to construct, especially long-term scenarios that are quite, sometimes their scenario-based planning is seen as, sometimes some of the scenarios aren't seen as being realistic enough. And I think there is much more needed in that area. And this pointed to the challenges of addressing those scenarios and developing them, but also to even the pieces of any given scenario, because every one of them has a certain level of certainty and uncertainty associated with them.
Great. Tia, would you like to mention what University of South Florida is thinking about follow-up and next steps? You're muted. Maybe you can type something in the chat and we can read it if we can't get.
So while Tia's writing, I will say that we are continuing to work with the Department of Transportation on not projects that aren't student focused, that are being done by our research staff on developing some tools that will help better understand the resilience of specific infrastructure types, assets in different parts of the state. So I think, Jennifer, we're working on 2 or 3 projects together right now in that area.
And I would say similarly, I've started working with a group of, I don't know, about a dozen faculty at the University of Florida that are looking at resiliency and sustainability related topics. And I have a meeting with Jennifer on that next week, as a matter of fact. So.
Tia, any luck? All right, well, if you have any other questions while Tia's sending us some thoughts, type them in. We really enjoyed at the department, I think the highlight of our long range visioning session that we did was the student panel, where they made brief presentations, but they then had some question and answer, and it was a great great exchange, and it really energized the group that was there to help us with the with the visioning session. So we hope that hearing from these folks about the research that they've done and the tools that they've developed will spur some ideas for you all in your planning. And any of us would be happy to talk with you any further about any of the details, because obviously there's a lot more here than what they have been able to present today. So I'm not
And
seeing
this is
anything.
Christine, your webcast moderator. I just want to add in as a reminder that we are recording this session and it will be available on our YouTube channel. Just search Planning Webcast on YouTube and it'll pop up. And we will also have a PDF copy of this slide deck available on our webcast webpage, ohioplanning.org/planning webcast. I'm not seeing anything else. Tia, was Tia able to type anything in? I'm not seeing anything.
No, it doesn't look, I see her shaking her head. No.
Okay. All right, well then I guess we will wrap up for today. Thank you to the Transportation Planning Division and all of you down in Florida. Thank you for speaking and thank you for joining us today. This was a really great panel and this was really interesting. So everyone, thank you. Have a good weekend, stay safe, and we will talk next time. Bye everybody.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you.